How far have you read?
Just to where we are.
Oh, okay.
I don't really have time to read extra because I have a job and I'm not 16, so... Hey everyone, welcome back to the featured-length podcasts little book club series that we're doing. For anyone confused by what this is exactly, please go back, listen to the first episode with a little introduction on what the book club is. Today we will be continuing our book club on everybody's favorite book, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I am joined by Dante.
Hey everyone.
Yeah. I don't know why you always have to say hey everyone in a completely different voice than what your actual speaking voice is, but welcome back, Dante.
Thank you very much. Glad to be back.
Yeah, good. Okay, so I think what we are going to do here is, now that we're kind of entering not just the introduction, the letters, but like the proper book, we'll have a little bit of a structure where for whatever chapters we talk about in a given book club episode, we'll go through and do kind of like a summary, talk about the chapter, any notes, any thoughts. We'll try and avoid like future discussion of things, if that makes sense, and just stick to sort of what we knew at that moment in the chapter, unless there's like stuff that crosses over between that we actually need to discuss. So today, as you can tell by the title of this episode, we are going to be discussing Volume 1, Chapters 1 to 4. So for anyone who's not aware, we talked about last week that the book starts with these sort of like this cold open of 4 letters. And then the actual main text of the book is split up into 3 volumes, as it were. And those volumes are subchaptered. So that's how we'll be keeping track. So we're doing Volume 1's Chapters 1 to 4 today. Yeah. Before we do that, going back to what this whole thing is that this is your very first time reading this.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So as of, I know you've read a little bit ahead, but let's just try to think in terms of like chapters 1 to 4.
Yeah.
So as of what you've read up to that point, up to chapter 4, where are you kind of at overall with this book? Every episode I kind of want to touch base and see like where you're at overall. So where are you at overall with Frankenstein as of chapters 1 to 4?
I mean, like, as far as it goes, I'm pretty enthralled. I mean, right now it's like a story in a story kind of, because it started with Walton, and now we're kind of getting Victor Frankenstein's perspective, and it seems like, I think it might be a trend that there's going to be like different climaxes in the book, if that makes sense. I don't know. I have that feeling because it kind of built under like Frankenstein's work. Yeah. And it was very central, like the first few chapters on his family life, but it was also just like, his work in natural philosophy and how things are going with that, and how like devoted he is to it. And as we got to the end of these chapters, it kind of showed like a climax to his creation, and we don't know how he got to his creation. It was stated that would be explained later in the book, but
it's not.
It's not?
No, it's not.
Really?
Yeah, not at all.
Well, why'd they say that then?
They didn't say that.
They did, I swear.
No, they really
I'll find the page,
okay,
I promise.
You find the quote. But anyway, what else, what are your overall thoughts on how much you're enjoying it or not enjoying it?
I'm enjoying it. I'm invested. Okay. Yeah, to the end.
Cool. So you are invested in the story thus far. All right, cool. Well, that's good to know. I'm glad. How do you find the read? Do you find it like a challenging read, a moderate read, an easy read?
Honestly, not too bad. It helps now in English class we're doing Shakespeare, so obviously it's going to be like decipherable.
It's easier than that. Yeah, that's for sure.
Yeah, no, it was honestly, I feel like I'm reading it at a perfect time where I'm just at the point now where I can actually appreciate the story behind this and not just feel like confused by like a million words. So.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, so I'm enjoying it a lot.
So you feel like you read it at a good place. Good. Yeah. Good. Have you found that quote?
I will, I promise. Give me a second. Okay. So, it's here. I'll just read the last sentence.
What chapter?
It is middle to end of 3.
Okay.
So it is, he's just stating about kind of like the wonders of his findings.
Yep.
And he was like, I was like the Arabian who had been buried with the dead and found a passage to life aided by one glimmering and seemingly ineffectual light. And so after this, he said, I see by your eagerness and the wonder and hope which you express, my friend, that you expect to be informed of the secret with which I am acquainted. That cannot be. Listen patiently until the end of the story, and you will easily perceive why I am reserved upon this subject.
Yeah.
So did I like misinterpret that entirely?
Yes, correct. Nice try. No, so what he's saying there is he says, you're interested. He says, what he's saying is I can't tell you.
Oh, okay.
But you'll understand at the end of the story why I can't tell you. That's basically what he's saying. He's not saying, like, I will tell you. He's saying...
Can't tell you about what, though?
About the secret.
Right. So, like, there is, like, there is a secret that he's not telling us till the end of the story.
But he doesn't tell us at the end of the story. He can't ever tell us. And at the end of the story, we'll understand why he can't ever tell us, basically.
Oh, gotcha.
And that secret basically being how he reanimated the creature.
Right. Yeah. That's what I assumed it was.
Is, which we'll get into when we talk about chapter 4.
Cool. Yeah.
There's a lot to talk about there.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
Right, now I'm glad that's out of the way. Yeah.
Glad we cleared that up. All right. Well, then let's get started. Let's start with chapter 1. So I wrote a little summary. You can compare it to what you have. If I missed anything, you go ahead and add it in. Okay.
Sure.
So our chapter 1 summary here is that we learn about Victor's upbringing. We know that his father married his best friend's daughter.
Yep.
And then ultimately, after that marriage, they bring in Victor's cousin Elizabeth as like sort of part of the family, to raise as part of the family because
it was his. Was it the father? No, it was his father's sister married an Italian man, right?
That's right. But
yeah.
Something happens there, right? Where she becomes like an orphan. They die.
Exactly,
And then so he brings her in. And then the intention there is also that like basically that they're betrothed to each other. Not literally betrothed, but it's sort of like understood in the family that like, oh yeah, you guys are the same age and stuff, so you'll get married, basically.
Kind of crazy.
Which is kind of crazy. And then we also learned that Victor has been, in his own words, seduced by various sort of philosophers and stuff, although he name checks Agrippa, which we'll talk about, and just the overall sort of concept of old alchemy, which we can talk about that a little bit as well. So, and then basically we learned that after he kind of had an experience where he first learned about electricity and sort of like the modern science of the time, this made him sort of fall out of love with alchemy because he realized the ridiculousness sort of it, or at least that's sort of his takeaway of it, right? Okay, so that's kind of summary for chapter 1. Did I miss anything in summary that you want to talk about? And if not, we can just kind of get into your thoughts.
Not particularly. It was just probably the role of his mother and father. He made a point of saying that the role of education of his life was largely guarded and like supported by his father. Yeah. And his spare time and his love and how he learned to care for people was largely concerned with his mother's care. Yeah. And based on events that we're going to get to, I feel like it's important that we distinguish between the different parental roles. Because,
that's a good point. In terms of the stuff we're going to talk about later.
Yeah. Yeah.
What did you think of kind of this first chapter as a whole in terms of like finally getting into Victor as a character, and kind of hearing from his point of view?
I think it was good, especially hearing about his family. Like, they're very wealthy, obviously, and was Henry introduced in this chapter?
I think his friend Henry was introduced
at the very end. Yeah, so
Henry Cavill.
Yeah, Henry Cavill. Yeah,
Superman.
So yeah,
it's Henry Clerval, right?
Yeah, Clerval. Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
I also read as Cavill though.
Of course. Time. Yeah, everybody, that hasn't aged well.
Yeah. Anyway. But I was particularly interested about him going into chapter 2 because they spent a fair amount of time and in quite a bit of detail explaining Clerval and his fascination with theater. Yeah. And his creative upbringing. So I kind of figured that later on he would be important. So yeah, there's a few characters that stuck out. He was one of them. So I was excited to see.
Yeah, it's a good setup. I think my takeaway, like reading this now as a first chapter, like it's very biographical.
Yes.
And it is funny even then to get into sort of chapters 2 to 4, which we'll talk a little bit about like later. But I found like the narrative thrust of those chapters way more interesting. This one was a little bit like, I was like, okay, yeah, so you're this guy, and then this
it has to be established.
The family tree, and I get it, it's all got to be established, right? And that's sort of the difference between a novel, and I guess that's part of the reason why, in terms of my own writing, like I thought it would be like novel stuff, and then I shifted away from that because I kind of am uninterested with
this kind of build up.
Yeah, with the historical side. Right. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's fair.
The history of it. I will say that, there are interesting things to talk about here right away. First of all, I think it's really interesting, this whole, like, he's basically betrothed to his cousin. Yeah. There's some notes about that we'll get to later.
Okay, good, yeah.
But the other thing that I think is interesting is also that we kind of see Victor go on this arc with, like, philosophy, or not philosophy, but sort of like this old like alchemy and this sort of witchcraftian type stuff, and it was sort of interesting that we kind of end this chapter in a place where he's not interested in any of it anymore. which I again, as an introductory chapter, was kind of like I forgot that it was like that, and it was it was just an interesting choice. I feel like one way or another to have it not be. I feel like the more typical choice there would be that something happened and we introduce the idea here that like we give Victor the inception point of like why he's even interested in potentially bringing someone back from the dead or reanimating life. That he would like have a story here in his youth, but we don't get that at all. If anything, we're like he was actually completely like pushed away from all that stuff, which was very like and and obviously there's so much context to that we all have for Frankenstein, right? So somebody reading this at the time, you wouldn't necessarily be thinking that's a weird choice, but in hindsight, not just having read the book before, but just knowing the story of Frankenstein, the broad strokes,
and now
weird choice.
Now that you've actually pointed that out, it makes it even more interesting, his complete like devotion and just like what was the term you used at the start, his like I can't remember. It's okay. Anyway, but his just like absolute dedication to it is just that's a stark contrast. So I never really thought about that. But
it's an interesting choice one way or another. I mean, so I want to talk a little bit about some cool stuff here. So so this Agrippa person that Victor says he's like seduced by. So he's a famous occult philosophist. So again, we're talking about sort of more witchcrafty and not really based in actual science. And sort of like an alchemist. Do you know anything about alchemy?
Alchemy, I know it's like kind of the precursor to chemistry, like the basic.
Yeah, foundation. It was all about sort of these sort of, again, more I guess magical ideas.
Yeah.
Not all of it, but it kind of delved into that territory because there wasn't necessarily the true scientific understanding.
Yeah.
That
No like foundations, right?
Yeah, and it sort of builds to. There's some concepts of alchemy that are pretty well known in pop culture, and I would even say in like the 1800s when this was written, like
for sure
popularized then, which are sort of like the search for the elixir of life or the philosopher's stone, or these things sort of give like eternal youth or harken back to creation in some way, having to do with like the giving of life. So I mean that's a nice little through line without saying it that's what this story is going to be about, but to show that Victor is kind of like enthralled by that in his younger years, I guess does fulfill that purpose of where maybe that drive comes from. But again, it was just sort of like the ending of the chapter with him being like, forget it. It was odd. But those through lines are there, and the callback, not the callback, but the pointed reference to Agrippa and sort of what an alchemy and stuff like that was interesting, an interesting setup for him as a character.
I agree entirely. And just looking back on Agrippa, back at the footnote, it actually says, perhaps the most sinister of the trio of Renaissance scientists studied by Frankenstein, referring to Agrippa, because he was popularly remembered by the story of his disobedient apprentice, who on peeping into his master's books conjured up the devil. So
nice.
Kind of relating to Frankenstein's story.
Sort of, it kind of does. It is. It's a good...
Sure.
It's a good call to make him interested in that. I just found like the narrative pacing of like that he started being interested in that and then lost it. I was like,
I get that.
I almost would imagine it the other way around.
Exactly.
Like that he was this like science-y kid or whatever that then gets seduced into this stuff that people think is like crazy and ridiculous.
And then after going through
and that's what happened. But I don't know. I mean, it's again, I think it all does come together, especially by the time you get to chapter 4. It all comes together in a way that makes sense, but just an interesting choice one way or another.
For sure.
I have a quote here that I pulled that I kind of wanted to take a look at.
Sure, go for it.
Because I think it brings up a conversation that we didn't really have in the last episode. But I'm going to bring it up now.
Go for it, yeah.
You can have it. Okay, so I found this quote here. I'm going to read it to you. So just listen for now, and just maybe tell me what you think of this quote. If it stood out to you in any way when you read it, maybe I'll say it, and you'll be like, oh yeah, I remember that. Or if not, let's talk a little bit about that, and then I will explain why I pulled it.
Sure.
Okay, there's an interesting reason why I pulled it. Okay, so, quote, "My application was of longer endurance, but it was not so severe whilst it endured. I delighted in investigating the facts relative to the actual world. She busied herself in following the aerial creations of the poets. The world was to me a secret, which I desired to discover. To her, it was a vacancy, which she sought to people with imaginations of her own." End quote. Okay. You're nodding. Do you remember that quote?
Yeah, I remember that quote distinctly.
Okay, you do remember that quote distinctly. Okay,
I made like a mental note of it as I was reading.
Okay, good. So did I. So that okay. So this is really fascinating. So first of all, like, Why do you think that?
Because, well, in part because, well, like you said, if Elizabeth, and this is referring to Elizabeth and Frankenstein.
Yeah, sorry, I should be clear. Yeah. This quote is Victor Frankenstein talking about himself in relation to Elizabeth, his cousin / betrothed.
Yeah. So, yeah, if they were to be married, I think I noted a contrast here because he's so focused on the material world, and if she were to be focused on, like the arts or other things, I guess dealing with the material world but more abstract.
Yeah,
I felt like that was good writing and good duality, and I kind of took away the notion of like opposites attract. So I feel like if I could make a prediction right now that they're gonna end up together, I think just because of that notion, but I could be completely wrong, but that's the way I took that.
Okay.
Upon first hearing it.
So it stood out to me really for no reason other than I just thought it was like really beautifully written.
Yeah, that too. Yeah.
And like in particular the line, "The world was to me a secret which I desire to discover. To her it was a vacancy which she sought to people with imaginations of her own." I read it and I was like, oh, that's a really beautiful line, and then I kept reading the thing, and then I went back to do the footnotes because there are like footnotes in this book, or not even footnotes, annotations. There's annotations, and then you can kind of go and read. And I had made a note to myself that I wanted to write that line down and just be like, Mary Shelley, what a good writer. You know what I mean?
Come on, she's so great.
Mary Shelley, what a great writer. And the footnote for this kind of rocked my world a little bit because
really, okay,
the footnote for this said that this line is actually, and you can tell this by the handwriting in the manuscript, this line was actually an addition from Percy Shelley, her husband.
Really?
Yes. Which kind of rocked my world. And I had to stop for a second and be like, and just for clarity for anybody listening, this is not going to be a conversation where I'm like suggesting that Percy Shelley is the brains behind this. That's not what I'm getting at, right? Like, this is not a discreditment of Mary Shelley, but I think what's so fascinating, and the conversation I want to have right now is the male versus female lens.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
So I think that's important to talk about when talking about this book, because this book being the kind of starting point of what we view as modern science fiction, the archetype of the mad scientist. Like, it's all from here. Mm-hmm. And a genre which, in popular fiction, pretty much ever since she started it, has been populated by men, like most genres for much of history, but then even to the modern day, still quite populated by men. And it started from this woman writer, so I do think the perspective of like the female lens is going to be important throughout this book, and we should refer back to that.
Yes.
But then this line in particular really made me laugh, because the fact that it stood out to me and also to you.
Yeah.
And just like me and you as straight white men, we heard this line and we were like, oh my god, this line is just absolute genius.
Just so cool. Yeah.
It's just absolute genius, you know what I mean? Such a great line, what a beautiful line or whatever. And of course, like, it was written by a guy. Yeah. And like in the description of it is like, when that clicked for me, and then I went back and read this line again, I was like, oh yeah, I know why I like this line. It's because it's the exact type of thing I would have written about a girl in grade 12. You know what I mean? Like, it's the most,
that's
like,
fair, yeah.
just keep that in your mind. Just imagine you're like a grade 12 in like a poetry class or whatever, and you just write, "The world was to me a secret, which I desired to discover, but to her it was a vacancy, which she sought to people with imaginations of her own." Like, it's just it's such a, like, a guy...
Yeah.
Like,
sure.
A male lens view of the situation. Of like, oh, I'm just so broken and crazy, and I just have to do science. But like, she's just so perfect, and she like fills the world with her love. Like, I don't
ideas,
know.
Poetry,
it's like, it's so I don't know. I just thought that was so funny, and like, we're gonna come back as we do this podcast series on this book. I'm so excited to like come back and take a look at sort of that male versus female lens.
Oh yeah.
And see what lines there are. I mean, this isn't the only one, right? Percy Shelley did add lines to the manuscript, so I will be excited to see that.
Oh wait, no.
No, Percy added lines.
Oh, sorry,
her husband.
Yeah,
to her.
Yeah, I get you.
To her work. So, I think it'll be really fascinating.
Just to clarify, was it not originally published under Percy Shelley, and it was later changed to Mary Shelley? Did we discuss this?
I don't know if we discussed it, but if you know the fact about it, you can
I honestly like don't know 100%, so you could probably fact check me on this after. But I'm fairly certain for the first little while it was published under Percy Shelley, and then into the 20th century it was changed to Mary Shelley because obviously
that makes sense. Yeah. That makes sense. Yeah, because he was like the husband. Yeah, so that's how that works. But
I would also like to point out and the annotations I have in my book, they're usually more relative to the context of the story. So I don't get like sneak peeks like that. So that's always really cool to see, like just the historical context.
Yeah. We'll talk about. I mean, I have a lot of other annotations for this chapter that we can get through. But I thought that was really interesting. Just like
for sure,
it's something I want to keep coming back to whenever there's an opportunity to talk about like the lens. But
100%.
Yeah, it made me laugh.
Yeah,
it was literally a week ago from today. It was we're recording this on a Sunday. It was last Sunday night.
Yeah.
I sat down to read this chapter, and I hit that line, and I was like, genius. So good. Yeah, it's such a beautiful... And then I was like, of course, this was the one written by the husband, because that speaks to me being, just a guy. And that absolute high school poetry sensibility.
Of course, yeah.
Okay, cool. So I have some annotations that we can now look at and talk about. Most of these annotations are going to be focused on like changes, as we talked about. So I don't think anybody is just going to be jumping into this episode, but for context, there are two versions, the two most popular versions of this book. The original 1818, which is what we're reading, and then the 1831, which is for a long time was the most popular one and now has kind of shifted. And as we talked about, why were the changes made for the 1831? Do you remember?
You're gonna have to refresh me on this.
Because Mary Shelley's husband and kids died.
Oh, yes, and it reflected a change on her worldview.
Yeah,
talked about that.
She was all like... Basically, the original story was supposed to be more about how ambition can kind of be a negative thing and how Victor's being punished for his ambition. But then in the revisions, she tries to make it so that way Victor's a bit more sympathetic. Like, all this stuff just happened to him. Like, it was destiny that all this stuff... And we'll see that in some of the changes, and they're kind of bad, but it's okay. Okay, so the first one I want to talk about... is annotation 3. It's really early in here. So I want to ask you this one, why you think this one was changed, okay?
Okay.
Because I literally don't know.
Sure.
Okay. So in the original book, the line is, he passed his younger days perpetually occupied by the affairs of his country, and it was not until the decline of his life that he thought of marrying and bestowing on the state sons who might carry his virtues and name down to posterity.
Referring to his father?
Yep.
Yeah.
And then in the 1831, Mary Shelley changed it to, he passed his younger days perpetually occupied by the affairs of his country. A variety of circumstances had prevented him marrying early, nor was it until the decline of his life that he became a husband and the father of a family.
Interesting.
So the first line is a bit more like, we're giving him a very specific reason, which is that he was so driven. He was occupied.
Yeah.
By things until he decided to.
The second one seems more like ambiguous. Like, just because of some circumstances he decided...
a variety of circumstances.
Yeah, a variety of circumstances, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think that's kind of funny.
Yeah, I do think it's funny. And then also it's like, so the first line, bestowing on the state sons who may carry his virtues in name, right? Which I think implies some sense of, again, maybe pride, ambition, whatever. Yeah. Like, he's this important person. He wants to have sons who are important people. And then the new line is... he became a husband and the father of a family. Yeah. You know what I mean? It's like we're focusing on a different thing.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And I feel like maybe Mary Shelley fixing that at a different point of her life has to do with, changes in perspectives like you talked about. She had a family and she got to see what that was like. So maybe it didn't quite sit right with her the way she wrote that the first time. But honestly, like from the themes of the story, I honestly prefer the way it's written the first way more, because I feel like it connects more to Victor, and there's like more relation between his father and Victor.
Yeah, of course.
In that first translation.
Well, that's going to be one of the funniest... Well, you know what? I'm not going to spoil anything.
All right.
Let's just keep going.
Sure.
So the next annotation I would like to talk about is annotation number 6. So this one is about his father's friend, who dies, right?
Yes.
And so he says of him, my father loved Beaufort with the truest friendship and was deeply grieved by his retreat to these unfortunate circumstances. He grieved also for the loss of his society and resolved to seek him out and endeavor to persuade him to begin the world again through his credit and assistance. So for some context, Beaufort, his friend, basically like lost everything, and
his daughter had to take care of him.
He
inevitably died.
Exactly, and so is basically what we're saying there. His father loved this guy. And he really wanted to help him.
Yes.
Long story short.
Which, before you keep going, that really seems similar to Clerval and Frankenstein. So.
Yeah, it does. Like later in the book. Yeah. In chapter 4, I think. Yeah. And then the revised sentence from the 1831 reads, he bitterly deplored the false pride which led his friend to conduct so little worthy of the affection that united them. He lost no time in vowing to seek him out with the hope of persuading him to begin the world again. Okay, so basically the main change there is getting the addition of he bitterly deplored the false pride which led his friend to conduct so little worthy of affection.
Interesting.
So why do you think the change to that?
I feel like maybe to take out any aspect of hatred that can be related to his friend. Like, I feel like blaming the idea and circumstances that happened to him would, like, you know, kind of keep the view of, like, you know, beauty and love he had for his friend. Because I feel like if his friend were to have a downfall based on his own actions, then it would be like, oh, his friend is, like, devalued. But if it's, oh, his friend was at a loss because of these circumstances, then kind of the image of the friend is, like, remains pure, remains perfect. That's the way...
But what I don't understand is then why make the change? Because the original one is, like, that some bad stuff happened to him.
Right.
And then... in the new one, it's specifically the false pride, and he's like, "Oh, I hate this false pride," and like it's like to me, it's if the change of her worldview is related to this idea of like destiny.
Yes,
I think the original way she had it reads more about destiny.
Yeah, that's fair.
Like I don't even know why this addition of adding the false pride thing in, as if that has anything to do with anything. Like it muddles it. Like, it actually made more sense with her changed worldview to keep it, I think.
Okay, can you state the change one more time?
Yeah. The change is, he bitterly deplored the false pride which led his friend to conduct so little worthy of the affection that united them.
That's 1818?
That's the change. That's 1831.
Okay, 1831.
And then the original one is, my father loved Buford with the truest friendship and was deeply grieved by his retreat in these unfortunate circumstances. Yeah. So, the original... literally says, oh, he felt bad because of the unfortunate circumstances.
Right.
Which is everything that she's trying to do to Victor with the changes, is to be like, Victor had unfortunate circumstances. Mm-hmm. But with this Buford guy, she's just like, no, but this guy, this guy actually, yeah. No, with him, pride definitely is the reason. Like, he's being punished for his pride.
Right.
I don't understand. Like, why even make that change?
I don't think that's a specification that had to be made at
all.
No,
it if anything, goes against everything that she's been trying to do with the other changes.
Yeah.
Like, that's a weird change to her.
That is very interesting.
So this one I don't have a specific annotation for, but just something worth noting out because it was pointed out in a few places. Mm-hmm. But in general, like obviously we talked about in this chapter, like we have a lot of family background, and the wording of that in the 1831 is changed to really make it clear like how much better his family life was. Like he had a good family life essentially. Whereas the 1818, like you said, we read it as not necessarily that he had the best family life.
Right, yeah. It was like sustainable, but it wasn't like...
Yeah, there were like implications of like resentment towards like his father for certain worldviews, or even his father like hating on him for his whole like alchemy, his intro to alchemy type stuff. Whereas the 1831 kind of does away with that.
Interesting. And
really just states more and more like my family was great.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Weaker change.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a weaker change.
A weak change. Okay, this is a big one.
All right, let's go for it.
So, in the 1831, it's retconned that...
Can you explain to me what retcon means again?
Yeah, it's just when you, like, in the future, after something already exists, a piece of art, you, like, change something about it to, like, change the way you read it.
You gave me the Star Wars example last time. It came back.
Yeah. So, in the 1831... Elizabeth is not actually his biological cousin. So in the 1831, basically Mary Shelley writes this line where she's like, Elizabeth was an orphan that they adopted, but that they were so close that they referred to each other as cousins. Yeah. And the reason she has that line in there is so that way for the rest of the book she can keep cousin, because there's so many times where it's like, oh, my dearest cousin, exactly, you know what I mean? So,
that's like.
Go off.
I just don't understand. Like,
go off.
Having them be like biologically related, I feel like that makes the connection stronger between them. Okay. Like even like, you know, I'm not gonna say anything, but going into like 3 and 4 when more stuff happens and there's other letters and discussions between him and his cousin, it's just it makes more sense that they're related, especially because of the kind of caregiving roles they have when they get older. They're relied upon by, you know, Victor's siblings and other people we're going to come to find out. And so I think having that relation as like actually being cousins is helpful because it shows their connection to the family. Just saying like, oh, she's like a cousin, I don't feel like there's as much of a connection between Elizabeth and some of the younger characters in the story, and I think that kind of weakens it, to be honest. I think maybe it makes more sense for the fact that I think they might be together later, but at the same time, for the purposes of the story, I don't see why that change had to be made.
Yeah, I mean, I think like the only reason to make that change is because of the whole like the betrothedness of
right,
it,
yeah,
right?
like
that
the romance, yeah.
But also, like,
yeah, exactly.
What changed between 1818 and 1831, where Mary Shelley was like, "Oh no, like this is actually messed up." Okay, like I don't think the world
it didn't reform that fast.
Yeah, you know what I mean, like. So I don't know. That's an
interesting one.
That's an interesting one.
Yeah, for sure.
Just something like to point out.
Yeah, food for thought. Yeah.
As we read, it'll be fun to look at maybe some things that happen and ask ourselves as we go through like what would the context of this be different. But that's another thing that I never honestly. My first time reading the 1831 in 6th grade, like I just assumed they were cousins.
Right.
Because I missed the one line where they were like. They were only like cousins, you know what I mean? Because I was 12 years old, and I didn't like hang on every word the way I am now. So I just assumed they were anyway, and it's fine. The book held the same weight,
for sure.
Okay, I got one more quote to end chapter 1
Sounds
that
good.
I would like to have a discussion on. Okay, so I'm gonna read this all out. I'm not gonna read the ending of the original chapter 1, it's the one we read, the 1818. The 1818 chapter 1 ending... Actually, you know what? Let's take a look.
I can go look at it.
I believe... Oh, yeah, it is here. Yeah, the 1818 chapter 1 ending basically just ends with Victor being like, and that's my family!
Yeah,
like, that's basically the ending. It's like, I think it's like, such was my domestic circle, or, something like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, okay,
that's literally it. Yeah.
So it's literally like, we get the summary, and then he says that, okay?
Yeah.
All right, so I would like to read, and this is a longer one, but I would like to read the ending to the 1831.
Okay. Yeah.
All right, and then
Let's compare. Yeah.
This will then lead into a whole other thing that I would like to talk about.
Let's go for it.
Quote: "Thus strangely are our souls constructed, and by such slight ligaments are we bound to prosperity or ruin. When I look back, it seems to me as if this almost miraculous change of inclination and will was the immediate suggestion of the guardian angel of my life, the last effort made by the spirit of preservation to avert the storm that was even then hanging in the stars and ready to envelop me. Her victory was announced by an unusual tranquility and gladness of soul, which followed the relinquishing of my ancient and laterally transforming studies. It was thus that I was to be taught to associate evil with their persecution, happiness with their disregard. It was a strong effort of the spirit of good, but it was ineffectual. Destiny was too potent, and her immutable laws had decreed my utter and terrible destruction."
This is the end of chapter 1.
That's the end of chapter
1. That is a big difference. Okay.
Okay, so...
And was he referring to Elizabeth for a lot of that?
No, he's referring to the experience of seeing, like, the lightning bolt experiment, which then made him uninterested. So, for context, right? He sees this electricity experiment, and then all of a sudden he's like, "Oh, I don't care about science.
Okay.
Like, I hate this, and I don't want to do this anymore."
Okay.
And then he hits that quote. Basically that, this almost miraculous change of inclination, like, basically, like, I changed my mind and I didn't want to do it, and this was the last effort of my guardian angel to save me from my destiny, but, destiny was calling and whatever. And that's the end. And it ends in this very ominous place. Like, that almost like, if this was the end of the story, like, I would have been fine. But unfortunately, I now have to go on and tell you what actually happened, right?
Yeah.
So, this is tough for me. And, because I think this is a way better ending.
Yeah, it's...
Than the 1818. The 1818, cool. As we said, is literally just...
Yeah, I can read just the last 2 sentences for context. Yeah, it's literally... Such was our domestic circle from which care and pain seemed forever banished. My father directed our studies. My mother partook of our enjoyments. There's no preeminence over one another. The voice of command was never heard amongst us. Mutual affection engaged complied us to abide with the slightest desire of each other. Yeah, all family related.
Yeah, it's just like our family was chill.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the ending of the... And this one is like, destiny has a chokehold on me, and I will never be able to escape its grasp. Okay, so I like this one way better, but here's the problem. I like it better because I am not reading it the way Mary Shelley wants me to read it.
Interesting. Okay.
So, what I would like to talk about with you now is author intent and how much you think it matters. Because Mary Shelley, as we know from her change in worldview and as for some other changes that she's going to make later, right? Mm-hmm. What Mary Shelley is saying in this updated ending is, that Victor literally is tied by fate and destiny to do this thing.
Mm-hmm.
And that literally there was an almost magical attempt to stop him from doing it. Mm-hmm. But that literally he is incapable of not, right? Mm-hmm. Like, we're literally talking about destiny.
Yeah, yeah.
But if you don't have the context of Mary Shelley's change of worldview, and you read this, I think, and this is where author intent matters, because, like, I think it just reads as a very ominous metaphor. Like, the metaphor of destiny, the metaphor of the guardian angel. Just, it's him basically waxing poetic, you know what I mean? And he's what he's trying to say to Walton, who he's telling the story to, is, you know, it's almost as if this was like a magical intervention,
right?
But there was some crazy destiny that was
that had to unfold.
That had to unfold, you know, or destiny, in a metaphorical sense, destiny in an angry sense, like almost in retrospect, like looking at it in that way. Mm-hmm. And I think that makes for a really great reading. Thinks it makes for really great foreshadowing. I think it's so much better written than the ending of the 1818, or of chapter 1 of the 1818. But what really sucks is that that's not what Mary Shelley's saying. Right. So what I would like to ask you now, forget Frankenstein, I would like to ask you a philosophical question about art.
Okay.
Which is, do authors retain ownership over their art in terms of interpretation? So, let me clarify. If an author of a piece of art says, I wrote this to mean this, and then you say, but I read it and I took away this,
right,
being something else, who's right?
I think I'd be under the impression that both of you are right.
Okay.
I don't think that art is completely subjective. Okay. I feel like, you know, there's a lot of things people can pull from art or literature where it's like, no, you were just completely wrong about that. That is not at all an interpretation that was supposed to be made.
Yep.
But with that said, I think, if I feel like as an artist, if you create something, whether that be art or literature or anything, and you put it out in the public, I don't think that you should have such a strong opinion of this is how it's supposed to be, this is concrete, because at the end of the day, I feel like part of what makes so many artists so good, and what makes Mary Shelley so good, and what makes so many of these people like so renowned for how they told stories, was because of the fact that they guide your direction of thought, but they don't limit it. Mm-hmm. So I feel like that's very important. I feel like artists should care for the thought of the reader and guide it in a specific direction. But I do think, you know, being so concrete about it and just saying like, this is what it has to be, like, period. No, like, I don't agree with that at all. I definitely do think, well, I don't think it's completely subjective. I do think interpretation matters for sure.
Okay, so you do think that once a piece of art exists, once the art is out there, a book, a painting, a song, whatever, a movie, that interpretations of that are equally valid.
100%. Yeah.
Not, well, I shouldn't say always equally valid.
Yeah,
like you
always,
said, there can be wrong ones. But that there can be multiple equally valid interpretations that should be considered.
For sure.
And that's fine.
Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I do. I think I personally agree with that. But however, now I have to push back on you because we're having a philosophical discussion. Right, and I'm going to play devil's advocate.
Sure.
Okay, so let's say, hypothetically, there was a weird orange president. Who...
Not to name names.
Not to name names. Who, in a rally of his, used a song by an artist to try to use that song to be a metaphor for his own success or what he was doing, right? Mm-hmm. But that artist basically came out and said that, like, you shouldn't be using my song because it doesn't stand for the things that you are pretending it stands for.
Right.
Okay, so what do you do about that, though? Because at that point, like, is the crazy dictator man not allowed to have an interpretation of that song that feels true to him? Or, hey, let me give you another one.
Okay.
Let's stew on that while I give you this one.
Sure.
Okay, so pretend you're me. And okay, let's start there. My back hurts, my knee hurts. Let's pretend you're me, and you're in 12th grade.
Sure.
Okay, and you read a book. Okay, mm-hmm. And this book, at the time, you have a crush on a girl, and this book makes you think of this girl.
Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So then 10 years later, whatever, you're not with this girl anymore. And you go back and read that book, and now that book has a completely different connotation or meaning to it. Okay, so like what interpretation of that is the more valid interpretation? Or are they equally valid? Are interpretations of a thing fluid?
I say yes.
Okay.
So to start with your second example, I'll go back on the first.
Yeah.
If you did make an interpretation upon reading something for the first time, and then you revisit it after a long time and make another opinion, I feel like that's this is difficult to say.
Yeah,
but
that's why I'm asking.
Yeah, I feel like both of those would be valid. I feel like in the context of the orange president in his in his song, I think it's just. I think there is.
I know it's tough. Because, like, I'm with you. Like, all of this seems like it should be easy to say that your interpretation is your interpretation and that's chill. But if your interpretation is, I'm using this to do a horrible thing, then at what point does the artist have the liberty to say, like, you have completely misunderstood?
Right.
But then if there is a line where the artist should be allowed to say that, right? If a evil person is using a pop song and then an artist comes out and says, you're not allowed to use my pop song because you don't get it and this is wrong and how dare you think that this is what it means. Okay, so we cross the line for that to happen, but then where's the line? Like, at what point does your interpretation stop being valid?
I think interpretation stops being valid when... just to put it into words. Okay, I'm going to roll with it and we'll see if this makes sense.
Okay.
Taking something out of context. In the example of, okay, somebody took a song and the artist feels like that person does not represent the song and none of their values represent that song and they should not have the right to use that song. I feel like the person who took that song is missing the context of the art or work of literature. If you look back at the interpretation example, you can...
But here's the problem with that, is that when I read that line from Mary Shelley, the first time I read that line, I didn't have the context of her worldview change. So I didn't read it as destiny being literal. I read it the metaphor way, which I like. So if Mary Shelley was alive and I said, hey, I love the way that you use destiny as a metaphor, and she said, you're a moron, I'm talking about literal destiny, and then I said, oh, should I have to change my interpretation of that?
I wouldn't say you'd have to change it. I just think you'd have to, like, understand the artistic suggestion that was implied by the author. Because I feel like as far as the story goes, it's equally as valid to be like, oh, this was just a great metaphor. Like, it is. Like, you know, but I think, taking Mary Shelley's voice into, like, actually, you know, valuing that and understanding her context is important. But honestly, it isn't black and white. I don't know. I find it kind of hard to answer those questions.
People talk about this all the time. It's a weird one, right? I mean, to go back to Star Wars, that's why, I mean, in modern pop culture, that's what people talk about all the time, is it sucks that the only available to legally buy purchase versions of Star Wars are the ones with the changes.
Right.
But people would argue, well, that's what George Lucas, that's his vision. So, like, that should be, because that's his artistic right to have that vision and put that out there. But then other people would argue, well, for 20 years, that wasn't the version that was out there.
Right.
And I grew up with that version, and don't I, as the consumer of the piece of art, doesn't my interpretation matter? Like, should I not be allowed to like that version that you put out more, even if you don't like that version as much? You know what I mean? Like, if I I mean, it's like artists re-recording a song. Same thing.
That's true.
Like, you know, so right now we're in the whole, like, Taylor's version era with Taylor Swift, right? And I know that it's basically the exact same, so this is not, doesn't really matter. But let's say there was, like, a discernible difference between those songs. And let's say any of Taylor Swift's cult fans were like, oh, I actually like the original recording better than the Taylor's version recording. Is that valid? Even though the original version sucks for Taylor because she basically is screwed out of anything on it because it was a bad deal and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so this is so much better for her as the artist. But like, if you enjoy the recording of the original version more, like, how do you then support that artist or their work, right? Like, it's very weird. It's very weird. It sounds simple. It sounds like you should be able to say whatever I take away is whatever I take away.
Yeah, but it's not that black and white.
But especially when you get into multiple versions of a thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Is where it gets weird.
Yeah.
And then the other way of thinking about that is like, so with a book, there could be literally two versions, the 1818, the 1831. But then there's like a whole separate conversation about the fact that, you know, I could listen to a song in 12th grade when I have a crush on someone, and then listen to a song 5 years later when I'm hurt about that person, and then listen to a song 10 years later when I've moved on. And is each one of those times I've listened to the song not equivalent to a different thing entirely if what I'm taking away from it is different? So like, if the first time I hear the song it's like a love song and I feel love, and the second time I feel anger, and the third time I feel nostalgia, like, at that point, what's the difference between me then looking at those three versions, and how is that different than like three different texts?
Yeah,
which are fundamentally the same text, but the subtext is different here.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, what happens there?
I like... It's crazy.
Yeah, it is crazy. There's no answer. This is like, author intent and ownership over a creative work is like a whole thing that we don't have to, like, I just thought it'd be fun to have like a 15-minute discussion on it.
No, it does matter.
And get you thinking about it, because it does matter, and especially as we go through, like, this is the first time with this change specifically where one of the changes I'm like, no, I like this more.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I've never considered that argument like so like in depth as we just did.
But also weird because I like it more, but it's not because of the reasons that you
exactly
want me to like it more. I like it more because of the fact that I actually think you accidentally made your original idea stronger.
And then is that still valid? There's what we're asking.
I think it should be.
Yeah, I agree with you.
I do think it should be.
In this context,
Of course. Of course. And the same way that if I listen to the same song 3 times over 10 years, that I might have different feelings of it, and each one might be a valid interpretation at the time I read it.
Yeah.
At the time I listened to it. Yeah. But then it's, you know, what if, at what point is it like not okay to have an interpretation of something? At what point are you wrong?
Right.
So, and we're not going to define a line, but I'm just saying, like, I think that's an interesting thing.
For sure, yeah, that was a really good point. Never considered that before.
All right, let's go to chapter.
Yeah, I can give some context to chapter 2.
All right, go ahead.
So basically, right off the rip of chapter 2, tragedy strikes. Victor's mother passes away, and this effectively delayed his schooling. I forget for how long, but it was for a little while.
A little while, yeah.
And so after this, he would leave behind Elizabeth and the rest of his family, and he would go to Ingolstadt, which is where he had an experience with 2 professors. I labeled the first one as the douchebag in my notes.
Okay.
So that was Mr. Maldman. Or no, sorry, the douchebag was Mr. Kemp, and Mr. Kemp was basically always on Victor and like ridiculed him for having a background with people like, you know, Agrippa and these other people, and he was like, you don't know basically the slightest thing about, you know, what people are doing now and how you should be thinking. And he was very like condescending and like, you know, making sure that it almost seemed like he was discouraging Victor from this by the way he was treating him. But after that, luckily for Victor, or maybe unluckily, as we see the book goes on, he finds a professor who decides to help him nourish his, you know, desire for natural philosophy and actually what the modern ideas are. And his name was Mr. Maldman. So he put him on a better path for learning. He introduced him to chemistry and physics, and I believe he let him use a lab as well. So, that was a really important part of Victor's life, and there was a particular stress on the importance of learning all aspects of natural philosophy. Victor wasn't, you know, just interested in chemistry or physics or thinking or, you know, moral and philosophical reasoning. He was, you know, trying to hit like all of them and, you know, form a good understanding of that. And one last thing before I pass it over to you again. It was specifically noted in the book that this was a very memorable day for Victor. His like coming to the realization with Mr. Maldman of all these different facets of learning. That was a big spark for him, you know. Yeah. So that's pretty much a big summary of chapter 2.
Okay. Yeah. This chapter's fine. I don't know. I think this is probably the weakest of the 3.
Probably, yeah.
In terms of my personal taste. So let me give you some thoughts why. Okay, first of all, I don't understand. I mean, it's really tied into the same idea, which is that I really don't understand where his like love of natural science comes back from. Because he talks about, as you said, there's the one jerk professor, and then there's the other professor who's like nice to him and stuff, right? But he very specifically says, there's like a line, I didn't write it down, where he talks about how he was like almost ready to leave. He was almost done with it and screw this all and whatever. But then like thankfully his like love for it came back, and you know, and he like doubled down and worked with this Walden guy.
Kind of tying into the destiny of like, this is gonna happen, you know?
Yeah. Which bothered me because
Aren't you in support of that destiny, though?
No, I'm not in support of destiny. I'm in support of, like, I like the idea that he refers to destiny as, like, a metaphor, like, after the fact.
Okay.
That he was like, it was my destiny that this was to happen.
Oh, okay.
Almost like that's how he justifies his crazy ambition. You know what I mean?
Gotcha.
Like, that,
okay.
You know, he can't stand to believe that maybe... But again, that's not the author's intent. That's my takeaway from it. But then even in the 1818 text... Destiny was never a factor, like in the which is what we're reading, right? So this isn't a rewrite. This chapter actually had very few changes from the original to the 31. So what I don't like about it is I don't understand why he decides to say. I don't understand. We see very clearly. We're like, okay, so he's whipped on alchemy.
Yes.
And then we get this detail of this science experiment and learning about electricity, and he's like, oh, I'm not interested in this anymore. The Toy Story meme of like, I don't want to play with you anymore.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, that's okay. And then in this chapter, it's so throwaway where he's like, and then my love came back for it. And it really bothered me too because of the fact that his mom dies in this chapter.
Yes.
And what I found so muddling about these first two chapters, but especially this one, is that it's like everything's there for it to line up. Like, it would be so easy to set the seeds right now. And I know I'm sounding very harsh. Again, this is my favorite book.
Yeah.
I love this book. But I'm talking from a perspective of, like, granted, a bit more of a modern perspective on this, right? To have his mom die, I feel like is such a inciting incident of, and then I double down on the science stuff. Or, as I mentioned before, why not introduce Victor in chapter 1 as loving science?
Right.
And then his mom dies, and he has this change of heart where he's like, well, regular science is great, but, like, people still die. And that's where he goes into the darkness of, like, the alchemy.
Okay.
You know?
I see what you're saying.
You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
And I understand that's a very modern, almost movie-like way of looking at it, like the inciting incident and all, but the structure of that narratively is, I just think, a little bit stronger than this weird, like, flip-floppy, I like science, I don't. I like it, I don't. My mom died. Is that why you like science? I don't know. We don't talk about it. Maybe putting it in the same chapter is supposed to mean that, but I needed, like, a line. Like, just one sentence even. Like, after the death of my mother, you know, my love for science returned, whatever, because he talks about it returning, but we never see, it's never like, there isn't a conversation with him and this professor where the professor is like, takes him under his wing in a way where we understand where that love came from.
Right.
We introduce all these things that should do it. Like, the mom could be the inciting incident.
Yes.
This cool professor guy could be the inciting incident. But none of it's explained. It's just like, and then it was back. And I'm back at it.
Yeah. I think, if I could add on to this, I have an interpretation of this, and
okay,
I want to hear your thoughts on it, if there's any, like, holes in it. But with the passing away of his mother, I mentioned previously that his father kind of made sure that he was going to be educated, and he had a lot of value in making sure that Victor would be very successful. And his mother was very, like, comforting, and obviously she was, like, the love of the family, and she, like, kept everybody together. I feel like with the death of his mother, it put a lot more emphasis for Victor on his education. And as we see after the death of his mother, he goes to school and is very focused on his education. Yeah. And his remaining parent alive is his father, who is completely focused on education.
Yeah, for sure.
So I saw that shift, and I was like, okay. And in part, I kind of felt like Victor's quest to make the inanimate living again, I feel like that stemmed, although it's not explicitly stated, I feel like that stemmed from the fact of the loss of his love from his mother. I feel like him wanting to bring back somebody and give life again was because he lost something dear to him.
Yeah, totally.
And lost the capacity to love. But yeah, I like where does that conflict with what you're saying? I'm just curious.
No, you're absolutely right about everything. I just think I need it said explicitly.
Right. Okay.
And that's just my sensibility. That's just
fair. Yeah.
Personally with what I like out of narrative.
Right.
Is I just need, it doesn't have to be a 4-paragraph treatise on how the things I would do to get her love back and what. I don't need that. But I would just love, it's in there, it's supposed to be that. Just give me a line.
Just a quick verification of
just
this
give
is why
me a
it's
line.
happening.
Just give me a line. Because especially when he's flip-floppy. It's not like he was in one place and then his mom died and now he's in another. Like, we've read 2 chapters and this guy has been across 16 different mental states.
Yeah.
Like, he's like... So, if that's the case, then I need something in there to not make it seem like incidental.
Right. Yeah, I get that.
Because he already changed. Like, in chapter 1, he already changed.
Yeah, he already switched up.
He already switched up in chapter 1 with no incident other than, like, a science experiment.
Yeah, exactly.
So, and then even with that, we get the line that I read about, like, this science experiment, what, the guardian angel that prevented me. So he's clearly referencing that science experiment. He's, like, talking about the way that it influenced him. And his mother died, and we get no discussion. Like, everything you're saying is true. Mm-hmm. That, well, his father was the academic one, and so it makes sense, and yada, yada, yada. It makes sense when we get to the reanimation in chapter 3, yada, yada. It all does make sense. Mm-hmm. But, like, we spent how many paragraphs talking about the science experiment in chapter 1?
Yeah, that's true.
And how it influenced his life, and we don't even get one sentence to be like, because of this, this is where I'm at now, by the way.
Yeah.
Which, exactly. I don't know. I again, not trying to act like I'm a better writer. Yeah. That's not what I'm trying to do at all, right? But just a criticism for me of this chapter. I think this is the weaker, like I said, the weakest of the original 4 chapters. I don't want it to feel incidental.
Right.
I'm okay to do a lot of the heavy lifting. I'm okay to put the pieces together like you did. I'm fine to do that. Mm-hmm. But just, like, tell me I need to put the pieces together. Right. Do you know what I mean? Yeah, I'll put them together. But it can be as easy as, like, and with the passing of my mother, I once again felt the change of my view on this subject.
Because that would give you direction.
That's it. Yeah, just this happened, so something changed with it.
Exactly.
And then let me go, okay, well, what did his mother represent and whatever. That's fine. I'll do all that. You don't need to spell that out.
Yep.
But, yeah, I just need a little bit more of a direct tie there. Again, and it's how I read it, is exactly what you said, is exactly how I read this book, right? The whole reason the reanimation happens is because of this thing. Mm-hmm. That's how I read it, but, I don't know if that's what she wants me to read. Does it matter? I mean, we just talked about that. But
exactly.
Regardless, one way or another, I would have liked a bit more of a strong take from her on that.
Yeah, I can see that.
Is all.
Yeah, interesting.
Okay, cool. I have a quote I want to read.
Go for it.
I just like this quote. There's nothing to talk about.
Sure.
Just when there's nice quotes that I like, and this one wasn't written by the husband.
There we go.
I pulled this one. Okay, it's here. Yet from whom has not the rude hand rent away some dear connection? And why should I describe a sorrow which all have felt and must feel? The time at length arrives when grief is rather an indulgence than a necessity, and the smile that plays upon the lips, although it may be deemed a sacrilege, is not banished. I thought that was just
good writing. Yeah.
That is just very good writing. I mean, he's talking about the context of his dead mother, but actually, like, what I like about that line too is that it really doesn't necessarily talk about death. It just talks about time taking away a connection.
Yes.
Which, again, I think it does what all good writing does, is it allows for interpretation.
Yeah, for sure.
Like, going back to our topic before. Mm-hmm. Like, that is exactly what you were saying, where it is about something. We know what it's about. Mm-hmm. He's in context, the character is talking about the death of his mother. Mm-hmm. But, like, the way it's written allows for anybody to be able to read that and go, oh, everybody understands, like, time taking away a connection. That can be a friendship or a relationship or anything. It doesn't have to be death. It can just be people going in separate places.
Exactly.
The kind of the treaty on grief.
I was just going to mention that.
Yeah, on grief afterwards was also, I thought, well written, right? That the time at length arrives when grief is rather an indulgence than a necessity, right?
Yeah.
Where it's just like, at a certain point, you just have to be like, for me to continue being in this state is not helping me.
Yeah.
Exactly. Which I thought was just an interesting indulgence rather than necessity is a really great way of saying that.
Yeah.
So I just thought that was a great line.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, I have another quote. Okay, so this one is, I think, kind of relevant to Victor. The quote is, "Besides, I had a contempt for the uses of modern natural philosophy. It was very different when the masters of the science sought immortality and power. Such views, although futile, were grand. But now the scene was changed." I like that. I think that is in defiance to what I said before about her not necessarily like pushing us in a direction with some of the handling of it. I think that line works really, really well, because what he's basically saying is like, yeah, I learned all this stuff and I got good at it, but I actually think that the way it's being used is stupid. Like, I respect more the craziness of people caring about immortality than I respect trying to figure out, chemistry. You know what I mean? Like, he's always ragging on chemistry.
Yeah,
this guy hates chemistry. He's like, what are we even doing here? So I thought that was a good line for the opposite reasons. Because it does push you in that. It doesn't over-explain, but it just pushes you in that direction of like, okay, he's gotten older, he's moved on, but
he wants
even
something greater.
In this state, he's like, but there was something about those crazy guys that they had right.
Yeah.
Which was, if you're going to learn this stuff, use it for something useful.
Yeah, push it higher, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So I thought that was cool.
Yeah, very cool.
There is only one change that I noted down. There might be other changes in this chapter, but there's only one that I noted.
Sure.
Actually, I'm not going to read this quote, because it literally is just another change where it's just a normal thing, and then it gets tacked on with like, but the hands of destiny were going to destroy me or whatever, which, again, I think it is so funny that you can just read that text and just think of destiny as a metaphor, or think of destiny as a stand-in for ambition. Like, the word choice, that what he's really talking about is his ambition, and almost like that he was like destined to ambition because of his father, because of, you know what I mean? Like, there's so many other ways to read it than I'm a crazy mad scientist, but that's what her intent is.
Yeah, I get you. Yeah.
Do you have any other notes on chapter 2?
Or
should we go to chapter 3?
I think we're good to move on to chapter 3, to be honest.
All right, let me grab my summary for chapter 3. Chapter 3 is, I think, the shortest of the ones that we've done in this thing. Okay, so my summary is, Victor masters chemistry. After a couple of years, he thinks about leaving, but decides to stay and try to solve the problem of animating life. Drives himself sick, putting together the perfect creation. So that's basically... This chapter is, I think, really where we get into the beginning of what people would recognize as Frankenstein.
Yes.
So right away, I mean, we already talked about this a little bit, but like my first note on this chapter is, what is the inciting incident to make him stay, right? Because he masters chemistry. He thinks about leaving, but then he decides to stay. It's almost like he does his bachelor's degree, and then he's like, should I go on? And then he's like, oh, wait a minute. Low-key, let me actually just try to like bring something back from the dead.
Yeah.
But there is no, like, what we talked about it, the connections that you can make as the reader, there is no narrative inciting incident.
Yeah, I get
There is a subtextual inciting incident if you put together his relationship to his mother and what that meant in relation to his relationship to his father, but there's no narrative inciting incident, and that kind of bothered me.
And then the only overarching concept to explain is destiny, and that's just not a valid explanation for everything.
Yeah, and that's only in the 1831. That's not. I'm purely talking about the original one.
Yeah,
even in the original one, there's no like notion of destiny.
Right.
Anyway, but so that's my biggest takeaway with this chapter was that annoying thing, which we already talked about a little bit in the chapter before. Other than that, I will say this is where we start to get into like the coolness of the science fiction and the grave robbing kind of, and using cadavers and like the sewing together and like a lot of the descriptions of that stuff, which is very like like horror science fiction, which I like.
Exactly.
What are your thoughts on this chapter?
I mean, I think I think it's fascinating that he drove himself to such a point to accomplish this goal. I thought it was kind of surprising. It kind of seemed like jarring at first, like his fall like really quickly, and he said he got really ill, but he felt as though he had to finish this task. Just like reading that for the first time, I was like, oh, like I was not expecting it to take such a turn, especially because he spent so much of his life so far in Ingolstadt, like being so rational with his studies. But like you said, he's like, well, why are we just doing chemistry? Like those quote unquote like crazy guys that people talk about, it's like, they had something right there. So I understand that in the sense of, like he's going to reach for something higher and he's not going to stop until he gets it. But yeah, I was surprised by the extreme that he took it to, for sure.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, but it makes sense though. It's really good, and that kind of leads like directly into chapter 4. Unless you have anything else to say.
I do have a couple things here I wanted to point out. One of the annotations. So there's a line in here. I was like the Arabian who had been buried with the dead and found a passage to life aided by only one glimmering and seemingly ineffectual light. Did you mark that down for some reason?
Is that did it say is that an allusion to another story?
It is. It's an allusion to Sinbad.
Okay.
But the interesting, I think, aspect of that and what the annotation draws a parallel. I'll read what the annotation says here. Mm-hmm. Victor's allusion may also be taken as a commentary on his view of his pending marriage to Elizabeth. He is trapped by his quote-unquote dead wife, and only creation, the creature, will save him from his fate. So basically the idea that, like, he is throwing himself into this work because at this point he feels like this is his only way out of a life that he's destined for, that he is not happy about.
Right.
Is a reading of it, and potentially is why the allusion to Sinbad, because Sinbad... we don't have to get into that whole story. I mean, there's a lot. It's outside of the scope of this. I don't want to talk about it. But long story short, the
idea of like breaking the seal, kind of like.
Yeah, not even breaking the seal. Breaking the. Breaking out of the chains of like what he thinks his life is going to be.
Right. Okay.
Which is also why we probably needed a line about why would I go home when my mother's dead? You know, like that's, I know that's, but like just say it. But anyway.
Yeah.
But anyway, then immediately after that, there's another line which I loved and I noted down for another reason. He says, "I see by your eagerness and the wonder and hope which your eyes express, my friend, that you might expect to be informed of the secret which I am acquainted. Yeah. That cannot be. Listen patiently to the end of my story. Blah blah blah." You said that. I like this line for a different reason. I like this line because it's one of it's going to happen many other times where we're reminded that we're reading basically like a transcription of Victor telling the story to someone, but it's cool because it breaks the fourth wall. Like, he's saying that to Walton. He's saying to Walton, "Hey, I see you're excited about finding out how I brought someone back to life, but I'm not going to tell you." But also, like, he's saying that to us, the reader.
Yeah,
you know, he's literally breaking the fourth wall.
Yeah, that's pretty clever.
It's a fun narrative device. I really like when you can use a narrative device to do stuff
and it works like that.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, there's another one here, another annotation. Let me find the quote and read the quote. "Learn from me, if not by my precepts, at least by my example. How dangerous is the acquirement of knowledge, and how much happier that man is who believes his naive town to be the world, and who aspires to become greater than his nature will allow. Than he who inspires to become greater than his nature will allow." So they point out in the annotation here, and it is interesting that even at this point, right, when Victor is telling the story, which is after everything that happened, he still blames... It's for him, he's like, it's the curse of knowledge.
Yeah.
It was like the knowing that was the problem, but like it's not. Like it's ironic because it's like it's what he chose to do with that knowledge.
Yeah, exactly.
Although, you know, that's not the worldview change, but that is the correct. I'm not gonna say correct. That is the definitive, I think, reading of the text that most people would agree on, is that it's like that he was blessed with this knowledge, but the things that he chose to do with it, he then had to face the repercussions.
Which makes sense in the context of Walton, who's on this journey for like the next best thing, which Walton stated would be like the change of humanity. And so Frankenstein's like, "Hey there, buddy!" Like
exactly. Which is why it makes so much sense to start the story with him. Okay, and then my last one for this chapter, and then we'll get right into chapter 4. "Who shall conceive the horrors of my secret toil, as I dabbled among the unhallowed damps of the grave, or tortured the living animal to animate the lifeless clay?" Which, do you know why I like this one?
I mean, I know you mentioned before kind of like that, like gothic science fiction like description, but why else would you like it?
Well, specifically I like it because he makes reference to to animate the lifeless clay. And if you remember, what's the subheading or the other title of this book, right, is The Modern Prometheus. And the Prometheus myth is all about stealing fire from the gods to bring life to his clay
That's right.
creatures. So that is just a word choice that works really, really well. Almost like, really remember cool. We talked in the letters about the conceive word choice and why that word choice was so good, but that reminds me of that. That's a good word choice.
It's just really good, yeah.
Yeah.
Honestly, I feel like the name The Modern Prometheus, that could have stayed, to be honest.
Yeah, it's better.
Yeah, it's really cool.
Yeah. All right, chapter 4.
Let's do it.
My summary is, it's alive!
Literally, that's it.
Yeah. Frankenstein freaks and leaves it there. The next day, they find Henry and return, but it's gone. Frank falls ill for the whole winter.
This is probably the most bewildering part of the story for me.
I love this chapter. Why is this Okay, let's start. Let's go. Because hit me.
He was so focused on creating this thing, so focused on bringing life to the inanimate, does it, and then that shift in tone, obviously, which is like fair considering what happens in the story. But aside from the shift of tone that Victor has, just to leave your creation that's been your inspiration for the past 2 years, inspired by your mother's death, to leave that thing out of fear, like, not going into anything else that happens later, focusing on now, it's just like, how could you do that? How could you spend and pour so much time into something and then just leave? I thought that was kind of radical for him to leave and like not go back and have the thing wander away. But like, I don't know, like,
okay.
Well, when I first read it, I was like, what? Like, I couldn't believe he was doing that.
Well, I mean, there's a few things we have to keep in mind here, right? First of all, we don't actually know if it has anything to do with his mother's death, or what I mean. Yeah, so that's one aspect of it. It's not like he's specifically trying to bring her back. He's just like, let me animate this thing, right? So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is we've already built up across chapter 3 this idea that he is like sickly, like he has dedicated his life's work to this. So he is not well, and we'll see later in this chapter he literally falls into a coma. So like there is a reading of it which is that he's just completely lost his mind. I also think. Well, I was going to read this quote later, but I'll read it right now. So let me read the description of the monster here. Sure. Because it's also very different. This will also be interesting for people than the, like, Frankenstein monster that you think of. Yeah. Right? It's not a giant green guy
exactly.
with a buzz cut.
Not at all.
Like, it's not that. How can I describe my emotions at this catastrophe? Or how delineate the wretch whom with such infinite pains and care I had endeavored to form? His limbs were in proportion, and I had selected his features as beautiful. Beautiful? Great God! His yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was of lustrous black and flowing, his teeth of a pearly whiteness. But these luxuriances only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes that seemed almost of the same color as the dun white sockets which they were set, his shriveled complexion, and his straight black lips. So, I almost think, he describes the monster as like a wretch here. He will continue to describe it as a wretch, wretched being for the rest of time. It's this book's favorite word is wretch.
Yes, it is.
But when you read that description, I think really what it's getting at is what he's saying is, when he took all these dead pieces and he's putting this thing together, right? Again, he's selecting these pieces as beautiful, all these beautiful things, but there was something about like the reanimation of it,
right,
that made it unbeautiful.
Right.
And so it's almost, I think we're already seeing here the understanding that the second Victor did this, he understands, and we as the reader are meant to understand that like he has done something nobody should do, right, in finding that secret. If we think about the myth of Prometheus, of stealing fire to bring life and then being punished for it for all eternity, like this is the beginning of his punishment for all eternity, because he, in playing God, has now created something that he understands to be horrifying. Like, because it's not life. I guess another reading could be like, it's not naturally created life. And we don't know, and we'll talk about like the methods of which how this creature comes to life. They don't get into, which I want to talk about. But that whatever that method is, and however he brought this thing back to life, that maybe he reanimated the body and that there is brain waves and whatever. But like there is something missing. It's almost like, I mean, you could take a religious reading of it and say, well, are they talking about maybe this thing doesn't have a soul? Like, is that what he's saying? Is basically that it's just a heap of, like, moving parts without a soul to it, which is, like, a whole other thing we can get into. But I think later in the book it makes sense to get into that when we see what happens with the creature. Frankenstein's monster. But, yeah, I mean, you're saying, like, it's, like, him dropping it. I don't know. To me, I don't think it's so much, like, him dropping it like, this didn't work out.
It was just the state that he was in at that point.
I think it was, he had worked himself into such a state to do this thing, and he thought in doing this thing that he would be God.
Right.
And then after seeing this what he perceives to be as like a soulless, disgusting thing.
Right. It's like, what have I done?
Yeah, it's truly the most like, what have I done?
Yeah.
And being completely incapable of doing anything about it.
Yeah, I can see that now that you said
it.
Yeah.
Now, where I will agree with you is this, on this chapter, right? Him leaving, I'm fine with. Him being like, well, I'm out, and just leaving this thing in his apartment, cool. I always, even when I first read this book, found it very, very weird that he brings this thing back to life, and then he's like, I'm gonna go sleep.
Yeah.
And then he walks like 10 feet over there, takes a nap, and then the creature like escapes from its shackles, and is like standing at his bedside, like, who? And then Frankenstein is like, oh, like he's all freaked out, and then he leaves?
Yeah.
That's the part that I think is weird. I'm like, maybe just skip the part where he pretends to like sleep in his own bed. Like, just go. Just leave. Because he talks about how he left, and then the next morning he finds Henry. Like, just do that. That's right away.
I do say, like, I agree with that, but I can also see like some symbolism. Like, after God finished creating the earth, he finally rested. So I feel like in that sense I see it, but no, like actually like in terms of the story, in terms of the ideas, I get it. Yeah, it doesn't really make much sense.
Yeah, it's kind of weird. I mean, it also it's funny because it plays into, there's like a modern reading of it that I don't think would have made sense then. But like the meme of, like the modern meme of like the kid that threw up and then is like standing at the edge of their parents' bed.
Yeah.
Like it plays into that.
Yeah.
Because it's like you have this like childlike creature that is literally standing at the end of his father's bed. But that like that is a meme from 10 years ago. Like that was not a thing in 1818. Exactly. So it's funny that the part of that has aged better for me, I know is completely unintended. Yeah. Like that was never supposed to be a reference to like a kid standing at the edge of the bed, because that wasn't like a known cultural thing back then. So
it's just kind of funny though.
But I do think it actually, if anything, has made it age better for me, because then I'm like, oh yeah, I can read it that way, and when you see what happens with the monster in later chapters and stuff, like that kind of makes sense. Okay, I want to talk about the bringing of the creature back to life.
Sure.
Okay, so first of all, in this chapter here, okay, let me just read the chapter that talks about how, or the section, the paragraph, okay, about how he says he brings it back to life. This is the only description we ever get in this book, okay?
Okay.
It was on a dreary night of November that I beheld the accomplishment of my toils. With an anxiety that almost amounted to agony, I collected the instruments of life around me, that I might infuse a spark of being into the lifeless thing that lay at my feet. Okay. It was already 1 a.m. The rain pattered dismally against the panes, and my candle was nearly burnt out when, by the glimmer of the half-extinguished light, I saw the dull yellow eye of the creature open. It breathed hard, and a convulsive motion agitated its limbs. So, from what you know of pop culture, how has Frankenstein normally brought the creature to life?
Lightning bolt comes down, boom.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, first of all, it's really interesting that the only mention of lightning is, he says, the spark of life.
Right, yeah.
But that's a metaphor.
Yes.
He's not actually talking about that.
Yeah.
He doesn't reference a thunderstorm. He says there's rain, but he doesn't really and he references the instruments of life.
Yes.
Makes no reference to what exactly that is. So, one thing I kind of wanted to mention here is, one of the things I love about classic science fiction is how, and I would even just forget classic, I would say good science fiction, even modern good science fiction, is how unbothered they are by like explaining the sci-fi part. Because for them, the sci-fi part is just like, well, you're gonna buy into that, and then don't get hung up on it.
Right.
It's not real.
Yeah.
And then let me tell you a cool story.
Right.
So like, here's good examples of that. Right.
Okay.
This.
Yeah.
This guy, doesn't matter, brought this thing back to life. H.G. Wells' Time Machine. First chapter of that book is literally a dude invites his friends over and is like, so I made a time machine. And then he time travels. Like, we don't have to have an Avengers Endgame, like, changing the past doesn't change the future. Yeah, exactly. Like, we don't need to do any of that. It's just like, the time machine exists, don't worry about it.
Yeah, accept it, yeah.
Accept it. Now, let me tell you a story about class. You know what I mean? Like, H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds.
Yeah.
Aliens show up. Why? Did the aliens come from a tragic planet where their culture was destroyed and now all they know is war?
No, they just show up.
They just show up.
Yeah, exactly.
They just one day, aliens from Mars show up.
Yeah.
And they're trying to kill us.
Cool, yeah.
And then they die at the end. Like, that's it. Like, there's no, like, who cares? Like, it doesn't matter. The aliens are there. What does our main character do about the fact that the aliens are there?
It can become so meticulous when you just, like,
correct. And it's also, like, not a narrative. So, here's the perfect example of this. And it broke my heart when this happened in 2014/15, right?
Okay.
So, in 2014, my maybe one of my favorite movies of all time, Interstellar, comes out, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Interstellar is a story very similar. I mean, they do explain a lot of the science in that, but Interstellar is fundamentally a story that's like a bunch of weird science stuff is happening, but it's about a dude that's got to go into space to do a thing and then try to get back home to his daughter. Like, it is a father-daughter. Like, when I think about Interstellar, I don't think about the scene where Matthew McConaughey explains what a black hole is.
Right, exactly.
Like, I'm thinking about, like, the scenes with him and Murph.
Yes.
I don't think about the explanation of the Tesseract. I don't understand the Tesseract. I mean, I kind of do. Like, I have enough of a background to understand. But, like, it doesn't matter if you don't understand the Tesseract. What you need to know is the emotion of that scene because we're telling a character story.
Yes.
Okay, people didn't like that movie. No, Interstellar, too much sci-fi, whatever, it's dumb, whatever. Okay. Then in 2015, The Martian comes out. Now, here's what I'm going to say. This is going to rattle a lot of folks in the sci-fi community. I think The Martian is the stupidest, worst science fiction movie I've ever seen in my life.
Really?
I hate The Martian with a passion.
You're going to have to explain.
Yeah. Because The Martian is a story that's central premise is every scene, the character will have to use some new science to do something. The entire movie is built around the conceit of how do we show cool science stuff. That's it. The entire movie exists to go from scene, or book, it was a book, to go from scene to scene to scene to scene of what's a cool science concept? How does that work?
Which prohibits any meaningful narrative.
No, what's the narrative of The Martian?
Yeah.
What? Okay, let me ask you this. Tell me some things about Cooper from Interstellar, Matthew McConaughey's character. What are some things you know about him?
I haven't seen the movie in so long.
Okay, well, I'll tell you, okay?
Okay, sure, yeah.
Cooper used to be a pilot, failed at it, feels like he never got his chance to do the one thing he loved to do, has a family that he really, really loves, but has now the opportunity to do the thing that he thought he was destined to do. He takes that opportunity, realizes that it was a mistake, and that the most important thing to him is his children, and now tries to find a way to get back home to his children.
Right.
Okay.
So science aside, that is like a core story.
That's a story.
Yeah.
That's a narrative.
Exactly.
And the widget of that story is interstellar space travel. Okay.
Yes.
The Martian.
I see. Yeah. Okay.
Matt Damon is an astronaut who's stranded on Mars.
Cool. Yeah. Yeah.
And then he's not stranded on Mars anymore after doing a lot of science. And also, there's some other characters who are on a ship trying to get back to Mars. Do they get there? I don't remember. Maybe? I think he, like, does something where he, like, jumps out of a rocket or something, and they do, like, a spacewalk, and they catch him. Whatever. Who cares? Like, that's not a story. Let me give you another example. A better version of The Martian. It was called Apollo 13, and it happened in real life, and then they made a movie about it.
Yeah.
Okay, 3 astronauts go to space. They go to the moon. Something goes wrong with the rocket. Are they going to be able to make it home or not? Okay. So, first of all, that story happened. So, there's, like, built-in stakes, because you know this really happened to 3 astronauts. But, regardless of that, we know those astronauts. Those astronauts have families back home. We're cutting back to their families back home. We care about their... I don't remember if Matt Damon has a family back home in The Martian.
No, yeah.
I mean, he probably does, because what the hell else would that movie be about? But, like, are they characters? Do they matter? Like, who plays his wife if he does have a family back home? I don't know.
I get what you mean, because then there's, like, no stakes. Like, if he dies, he dies. Cool.
Yeah, like, literally, if he dies on Mars, okay.
Yeah.
Like,
exactly.
Then, oh no.
Yeah. Whereas,
like what is this? If Cooper doesn't make it back home to Murph in Interstellar, that is the most, like, tragic thing to happen in, like, the history of cinema.
Yeah.
If Matt Damon doesn't survive The Martian, I literally would get up out of the theater, leave, and never think about it again. It would not even impact 1 ounce of my emotional being.
I can see that.
So that's what I'm saying about modern sci-fi. It's like the sci-fi part isn't the story. Like, I don't need 15 chapters on Victor explaining some BS made up thing of, like, how he brought this creature to life. Like,
oh, okay.
Yeah, okay. He's like, so I can't tell you because it might drive you crazy, but I just did it. Trust me. Okay, fine. I trust you. You did it. This chapter 4, the chapter where the creature comes back to life, there is exactly 1 paragraph where we talk about that, and it's the first paragraph. And then that's it. And then we are right into the story, right? We're right into how Victor's feeling, his mental state, the things that he goes through. He goes into a coma because of the sickness of, like, how hard he worked trying to make this thing happen. Oh my god, like, so much more interesting than if we had spent paragraph upon paragraph of like, and then I combined the wooji with the tinky bada, and then I used the elixir of those things to activate the Studa Buddha thing that I found.
And then I made the Gabazoo.
Yeah, and I made the Gabazoo, and then I found the element that connected the power of electricity and created the soul, and then I don't care. And that's all The Martian is. Like, I know this has turned into my rant on The Martian, but every scene in The Martian is like, in order to grow potatoes on Mars, the atmosphere is actually a little bit different. I'm like, oh, then die, Matt Damon.
What's funny is that's the only part I remember from that movie.
Yeah, that's the only part anybody remembers, because it's so stupid. Like, it's, oh my god. Anyway, that movie annoys me. That movie really gets on my nerves. And anyway,
yeah. No, I 100%, like, now that you say it, it bothers me less that we don't know, because then we don't get a full story about meaningful characters. We literally just have scientific explanations, and to what end, right?
Like, who cares?
Yeah.
There's so many, I mean, every fantastic work of science fiction ever does not over-explain the sci-fi part.
Right.
Even the Foundation novels, which I love, don't watch the TV show.
Mm-hmm.
Read the book. But, like, again, what is the first chapter of the first Foundation book? A guy shows up and says, don't worry about it. Don't worry about how. But I figured out a way to combine advanced math and psychology and make grand predictions about the future. And I predict that the Galactic Empire is going to crumble in however many centuries, but if we do these things, we can bring it back in less time.
That sounds really cool.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
But it's like, that's like the first 5 pages of that book.
Right.
Okay, do we ever learn about psychohistory? That's what it's called psychohistory. Mm-hmm. Do we ever learn about that? Like, the techniques of, like, how he did it? No, who cares? That's not what it's about. It's about the crumbling and reforming of a society over centuries is what it's about. And, like, what would you do differently if you had knowledge?
Right.
Grand sweeping knowledge. And, like, are there ways in which grand sweeping knowledge can be affected? Like, it's not about the widget. Like, no good science fiction is about the widget.
Right.
None of it is. That's why Avengers Endgame, just, I don't even, and when people, like, get hung up and start complaining about the time travel, and they're like, well, but actually, wouldn't the time traveler really, like, didn't they get it wrong because of this and this? I'm like, I don't care.
Exactly.
Like, did Cap get to dance with Peggy at the end? Yes? Cool.
Yeah.
I don't care.
That is genuinely the takeaway.
Like, I don't care that, well, technically, if this thing happened and that thing happened, then how would Old Man Cap even be there? Okay, cool. Right. You got me.
Yeah,
you got me in a fake time travel logic mind.
Yeah.
I'm glad. Thank you so much for that. That was such insightful commentary on this piece of work. Yeah.
And you know, I don't want to turn this into a whole Avengers conversation now, but yeah, to the point of, like, the previous Avengers movies, specifically Infinity War and the first Avengers, it was very much like the culmination of different journeys of people coming together to fulfill a cause. Yeah. And therefore it was meaningful. You're right, it wasn't just focused on, like, well, this is how we're going to pursue the cause, and these are the ins and outs, and this is, like, you know what I mean? No, it doesn't matter. It's just, like, like, I completely understand that, and I'm honestly glad that you told me that, because that honestly is, like, reforming my view of science fiction and what it actually takes to create a good piece
and
of
not
work.
even just science fiction. But, you know, another perfect example, right? I just showed you The Social Network for the first time.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you do not need to know and or care about Facebook, the history of Facebook, about coding, about... You can hate Mark Zuckerberg. Like, there is no context you need for that movie that could ruin that movie for you.
Right. And
because it's just a movie about the falling apart of a friendship.
Right. And to your point, like, at the start of that movie, it was like 2 seconds between Zuckerberg and Andrew Garfield's character just talking, and there was only 5 minutes of explaining what he was doing. And the rest of the movie was literally about them and, like, what they went through.
Exactly.
I completely get that.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. But of course, I think science fiction falls into that thing more often where it's like, how can I explain the science part of it? Don't.
Yeah, exactly.
Stop. Yeah. I showed up, I had a time machine. Now let's do a story with that. Let me tell you 300 pages of what I did with my science machine. Okay, like, cool.
Yeah.
I don't need the widget.
For sure.
That's interesting. I had a note here when he's talking about the creature coming back to life. I just thought this was interesting. It's a historical annotation. Victor's description of the events matches exactly the experiences of Professor Giovanni Aldini, who attempted to revive a hanged man by applying electricity. Yes. Yeah, so anyway, that's cool.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, like, I know he's never explicitly struck by lightning, and like you said, that spark of life is a metaphor, but I feel like just because of Victor's there's 2 scenes so far throughout the story where
we talk about electricity.
Electricity and lightning, and where Victor talks about storms and how he saw storms and how that was transformative. So I guess that kind of merged in with the idea of this is how the monster is going to come to life. But
it's a good. I mean, it's a reading, but again, there's no answer, and the answer doesn't matter.
Exactly.
So it's really whatever you want.
It's just up to your interpretation.
Oh yeah, and then the last one, the last note I have for this chapter, and then we'll see if you have any closing thoughts. So finally in this chapter, chapter 4, throughout all the letters, the 4 letters, and now these 4 chapters, we have finally arrived at learning Victor's last name, which is Frankenstein.
Yes.
Which is interesting because 1, that's like a really long time to not learn the name of the titular character of the book. 2, interesting that the chapter where the monster comes alive is the chapter where we learn the name Frankenstein.
Yeah.
3, because of, obviously in pop culture, the meme of people calling him Frankenstein and then saying, well, it's not, the guy's name was Frankenstein. This is Frankenstein's monster.
Exactly.
But interesting for her to reveal that here because it's maybe letting us know in a way that's the surname, this is his child, so that this creature is a Frankenstein.
Okay. I
don't know. It's just to me it has to be a choice.
Yeah, for sure.
Because if it wasn't a choice, in first sentence of chapter 1, he would say, "Yeah, so my name was Victor Frankenstein, and I'm from this. My father's name was whatever Frankenstein." It would have come up. Mm-hmm. So the fact that we were just first names all the way through, and then in this chapter where the creature comes alive, it's we get the name drop of Frankenstein.
Right.
Feels like it was on purpose.
Yeah, I feel like that correlates to waiting to mention his last name until the chapter the monster, the wretch, comes alive. I feel like it speaks to the destiny of his character if we're looking at the 1831 interpretation. Yeah. Just in the sense that at least I would interpret it in part completed by the creation of his monster. He thought that, this is what I'm going to work towards, and this is going to be a great discovery. So with the completion of his discovery, we get his last name. But I feel like in getting his last name, while we get the completion of his character, I feel like it also marks kind of just the point where it's going to go down, like you said with the example of Prometheus, right? I feel like it's just downhill from there.
Yeah, but it's almost like he's arrived. You know what I mean?
Yeah, he's arrived at the downfall.
The first 4 chapters were
that's what I was trying to say.
The origin,
yes,
of this guy Victor, and then we've now arrived at the Frankenstein of it all. Yeah. Which is funny because it's almost like that's something that a movie about Frankenstein made now would do. But the fact that this is the originating work and they also did that
is kind of insane.
Yeah. It almost shows a level of foresight into how the work might be interpreted in some way. I don't know. It is a choice, but it's just so interesting because I if there was a mini series about this or a movie about this, this is you remember in Oppenheimer when he first puts on his classic suit and hat and pipe and stuff. Yes. You remember that scene? And he walks out and it's oh yeah, sick, Oppenheimer. Yeah. That's what this is. But Frankenstein didn't exist before this.
Exactly.
So it's crazy. It's crazy that it exists that way in there.
Yeah. Very cool.
All right. Do you have any closing thoughts on chapter 4 specifically?
Just
any notes we didn't get to?
Just to mention plot wise, after Victor's illness, we see his friend Henry Clerval, come back. It's just important to mention. And Victor's recovery was largely due to Clerval's care for him over the next few months and nursing him back to health. So that's definitely something important to mention. But the ending of chapter 4 is marked with Clerval handing Victor a letter and being this is from your family. I forget if it was Elizabeth or his father, but he was this is from your family. You weren't in condition to read this before, but now you're well enough here. They'll want to see your handwriting. So that's kind of where we leave off plot wise.
It is, yeah. And we will pick up.
We will
next week. Before we head out, do we have any miscellaneous Dante notes and or questions?
Honestly, no. The only thing I was going to talk about was Elizabeth and kind of that betrothed, and I wanted to just clarify. Are they actually cousins? Are they not? And I guess it depends on the interpretation that we've talked about now. But I better understand her role, in relation to Victor and the rest of the family. So that's pretty much cleared up. And other than that, it was an insightful discussion, though, I have to say. Okay, a lot of things I never considered before, so.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
You know, one question I actually just thought of right now as we're wrapping this up, I was kind of going through the chapters in my head.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what, if anything, is the relevance of his dad, Victor's dad, marrying his best friend's daughter? Like, I know, let's take out the modern discourse around, like, the weirdness of him marrying someone way younger than him. Like, what, that was just commonplace in the 1800s. Mm-hmm. Like, that's not even worth talking about. Mm-hmm. But, you know, he could have married, he could have just been married. We could have started the chapter with, like, and then he was married. Mm-hmm. And this was my mom and dad. Why is it important that we spent this time establishing he had this best friend who we loved so much, and his best friend had some bad luck and ultimately died, and then he married the daughter? Like, why even spend the time doing that?
At least the way I see it, that's really hard. The way I see this is, I'll go back to Victor and Elizabeth just for a second. We see Victor, like, he was very concrete on knowledge and focusing on the material world and figuring out evidence and proving things like that, whereas Elizabeth was more like, you know, poetry, the arts, observations in that regard. Mm-hmm. I feel like there's a duality there, and I feel like there's a duality in Victor's father and in his best friend's daughter, because Victor's father was very, like, it says that he was, you know, a man that was pretty respected as far as, like, his hometown in Genevieve I think it was? Geneva, sorry, yeah. Yeah, he was pretty respected, fairly educated politically, and I feel like because of the care that the daughter took to support the father even in his death, I feel like that was kind of a mission for the father to be like, that is kind of like the duality I'm looking for. Like, while I'm so strong in these regards and I can, like, support my family in this way, I need that kind of, like, loving and other nurturing side, and that kind of shows with Elizabeth and Frankenstein as well, or Elizabeth and Victor as well. But I can only see the duality in that way. That's the way I saw it. I don't really know if you have any other take on it.
Maybe it is just the caretaker archetype. I don't know. I can't think of any. It's never explicitly talked about, so maybe it is just the caretakingness of it.
That's another part where maybe another sentence could have been used there to.
Yeah, or maybe, I don't know. I mean, it doesn't. But I also just think it's weird because it's like that we established the friendship. Like, the friendship was so close, and then he dates the daughter. Yeah. Like,
it could have been. It could have been father's friend.
Anyone. Yeah, like, it could have been any woman that he ran across that was like
with those same values.
Yeah, that was like a caregiver archetype, and he was like, "This is what I'm looking for." Mm-hmm. But it's the
attention to detail.
Yeah, it's the attention to detail of, like, but they were such good friends. Mm-hmm. And then, like, all this stuff happened, and then he, like, I don't know, it's like, what's it trying to say about Victor's dad and his values, and potentially, like, what I guess Victor maybe is supposed to have inherited from his dad in terms of, like, his own ambition and his own potential disregard? I don't know. Like, it's hard to say. I mean, I haven't read the book through in so long that where things go, I remember the broad strokes, but in terms of, like, smaller character details, I'm trying to think, and we'll see. We can always come back to it. Like, what things may be revealed about Victor, where it's like, oh, it makes sense now that we showed his dad being this kind of, like, skeezy guy in some way. Right. Because up to right now, I wouldn't necessarily say Victor is skeezy. He's been this, like, kind of flip-flopping guy who ultimately commits to this thing, feels like he has to do this thing, dedicates himself to it, does it, and then immediately regrets it. And that's kind of, like, at the end of chapter 4 where we're at.
Yeah, exactly.
So I'll be curious to see.
Yeah, we're going to have to put a pin in that for now.
No, I mean, I can't think of some skeezy stuff he does later, but I don't know.
We'll have to see.
Yeah. Next week. When we do chapters, what?
Next week will be chapters.
I think to end the volume is 4 to 7.
Yeah.
Okay, so
4 to 7.
Or sorry, 5 to 7. We did 4
you're
today.
Right, 5 to 7. Yeah.
Okay, next week we'll be on chapters 5 to 7 to end out volume 1 of Frankenstein.
Sounds good. Until next time.